Hey everybody, Nick here. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes today talking about active reading, and that's something I think that is an important thing that will be a useful tool for you to use, and will help you succeed in this class, but potentially will help you succeed in many of your classes. And it's something that I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about because just to give you an idea, it may be something you do already, but if not, then I think it's something that's worth definitely you being introduced to the idea of doing this. So, what is active reading? Well, first of all, obviously it's reading, right? So in this class has a large component of reading, right? But this is a special way of reading, basically. It's a technique, right? That will help you in your classes be able to do things like after you have read something, then be able to discuss it and or be able to write about it, and those are two activities when we just read things for our own enjoyment or for because we want to know information or things like that. Later on, we're probably not going to have to write a paper about those things or be given an exam about them or have to discuss them in class. And so as a result of that, like we just kind of we just read them and they sort of come in and then they, whatever we retain, whatever it is we retain from them, and then we forget, whatever. That doesn't really matter, right? So much. Certain things might stay with us, but it doesn't really matter if they do or don't, because that's not really we're not sort of testing that. We're just sort of we're exposing ourselves to whatever we kind of want to. However, in your classes, right, you're going to be exposed to and being asked to read things that you might not normally be inclined to read, maybe first of all, but also even if you were inclined to read them, you're the way you're going to go about dealing with them in the classroom is going to be different than you would if you're just reading them for fun, right? So that's really important to know that difference, right? For example, so what do we mean by active reading? Well, what we mean is when we're reading, what I recommend to my students is that as you're reading, that you read with a pen in your hand, a pen or pencil, right? You have a pen or pencil in your hand, and then you mark things in the text. Like, well, how do I do that? What do I mark? Like, how do I know what to mark, right? In the text. Well, what I would recommend doing is read with a pen or pencil in your hand, and then write on your book. And specifically, what I would do is I would jot notes in the margins. That's would be the thing I would recommend doing most of all is writing notes in the margins, just even sometimes just describing what a particular paragraph is about. Other things you can do is besides noting sort of like topics or things in the margins, right? You can sort of write questions that you have down in the margins, right? Oh, if you have a question about something, write that down. Or if there's specific lines in the piece that are really effective, go ahead and underline those. Okay, that's a really interesting piece or an interesting line. I'm going to underline that. If something's really effective, what I'll do is often underline it and then I'll put like a star next to it or something like that. Like over in the margin, I'll put a little star so I know that, oh, this little underlined thing is indicating this is a really important idea. If it's maybe like the central idea, I'll put maybe more than one star, like maybe three or something like that, just to sort of indicate like this is the main idea of the paper, or this is one of the main ideas I think the author is trying to get across, right? The main idea, we often call that a thesis, and sometimes thesis statements in essays are explicit, and sometimes they're not as explicit. But when we see, oh, this idea here, I think is one of the main things the author is trying to get across. I'm going to really make a note of that. That seems like an important thing to do. But again, they might be trying to get across numerous things in the paper potentially, so it's okay to go ahead and mark more than one thing. But go ahead and basically read carefully, right? So you don't have to slow down, right, so much, but read carefully and then read with a pen in your hand. Another thing that's maybe important to do is that in our textbook, for example, in the Siegel Reader, there's a little on the page that the piece begins on that you've been assigned to read. There'll often be a little biographical sketch. Sometimes that's called a head note. In some books, you'll note that the head note is longer, like it's actually not just an author's bio or anything like that. Sometimes it also gives you information about the essay that you're about to read. Um, One of the other books I sometimes assign, which is called A World of Ideas, that book has a little bio and then like 2 or 3 pages of kind of reflection and information about the piece that you're about to read and about the rhetoric, the actual writing of the piece, and about like how what the strategies it kind of uses in terms of rhetoric. And so that's a really useful thing. The Siegel Reader doesn't have anything that detailed, but I think that its head notes are still pretty good. It just gives you kind of like some background and some biographical data about the author. So it should give you a sense of at least what the piece is you're going to read, because that's maybe one of the things you want to think about first is like, what do I already know about this piece before I start reading it, so this is my prior knowledge, right? So do I have any prior knowledge about this? And that's something you can make a note about, right? If you do, then that's great. Like you're going into this with an advantage. Maybe you even have already read the piece in question. If you have, that's good. Obviously you need to reread anything that's been assigned for the class, because you're going to reapproach this material. Because if you read something like 5 years ago, it's not really, you really need to reread it. Because also you're going to notice things in it if you reread it that you hadn't noticed before. And that's inevitable. That always happens to people when they reread things after they've not read them for a while. So even something you read something a few months later or something like that, you can have a very different perspective on it, and see things in it that maybe you didn't see before. So those are things to think about. Like, what do I know about this? What do I know about this author? And it's okay if you don't know anything. That's fine too. But then that means that the head note, the little like thing that's going to give you some context, is maybe for you in that case a little more important, and you should make sure to read that. It's okay to also, if you really want to, go do additional background reading on the person. Certainly you can find information online about people or things like that if you just want to get some basic ideas about them. It's not necessarily bad to do that. Just keep in mind that Wikipedia is not always the most reliable source of information because it's an open source document, meaning anybody can kind of edit it. And so there's a lot of nonsense on Wikipedia also. There is some good information on there, but there's also a lot of nonsense. So you just have to be aware of that and be careful. Don't put too much stock in that. Anything that's obviously that's in the head note for the piece is obviously going to be more authoritative, because it's a published piece and they have a certain kind of responsibility. Okay, but so make sure to read the head note, and read with a pen in your hand, right? And then as you're going through, write in the margins and mark things. And that's really the two main things I would suggest doing in terms of like, how do I actively read? Okay. I want to go, so as I'm going through, I'm reading sort of carefully. I don't need to read super slowly. That's not what I'm suggesting, but just mark things as you're kind of going through. Obviously, if you're doing that, it's probably going to be reading a bit slower than you normally would. I will say this, though, that many of the pieces that we're reading in our class are not that long. Like many of them are only several pages long. There are a few of them that get to be closer to 20 pages or something like that. But there's not many that are like over 20 pages long. So the readings in this class are fairly reasonable, okay? And so what that means is that I think that you putting a little bit of extra effort into doing the active reading part of this class would be really useful. So go ahead and go through and mark the reading as you're reading it, and then like I said, the notes are going to be the thing that are most helpful to you. And then as what you want to do then is once you finish the reading, then maybe put it aside for a little bit, but then go back through and look at your notes, look at what you wrote in the margins, and think back about the piece and see if you notice anything like in terms of patterns. Like if you think about the piece as a whole, are there things now that you notice that you didn't notice when you first started reading it, right? That you do you see do you have a better sense of like what the author's strategy was in terms of getting their point across to you? How did they do that, right? And these are just things to think about when you're looking at the sort of the whole piece, right? So asking yourself those questions. But look, thing to do that is to note your notes. Now, other things you might want to mark as you're going through are, like I said, important points you think the author's making, effective phrases, or any questions you have. And then I think anything else that you just think is weird or unusual or interesting, like go ahead and mark those things. Like if there's, hey, that's a really odd, I don't understand what this line is about. Go ahead and mark that line, and then you can bring it up in discussion, or you can, talk about it, later. And that's I think a good thing to do. Obviously, this is not an ideal format in terms of interaction, but we are going to definitely be interacting online via the discussion forum. So that'll be part of what's going on in the class. So and that'll be happening this week. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of just mention those things. But okay, so just to recap, read the head note. Actively read read with a pen in your hand, mark things in the text. Then when you were finished going through the text and marking things, then go back and reread the notes that you looked at and look for patterns. So that's what we want to do, is we want to look for patterns and things that we see kind of like the bigger picture of the piece. And then once you've kind of done all that, then you can start to think about your reaction to what you read, right? And it's okay to have reactions kind of in the moment, but you don't want to spend too much time in those places. You want your goal initially when you're reading it and making notes is to just kind of understand what the author is trying to say, right? And then once you've done that, then you can start, and you're looking at the whole piece now, then you can start thinking about your reaction. Right. So, and this ties into the assignment that you'll be having, which is due on September 5th, which is the first summer response writing. I believe it's September 5th. It is it will be as part of this module. The first summary response writing, which is a summary and then a response to one of the pieces that we have read. I think in the first, few weeks of the class, it tells you on the assignment which ones you have to choose from. So, so pick one of those, and then you write basically a summary and then a response to it. Well, obviously, your response should be a thoughtful response that you have sort of formulated after, for example, having read it yourself, done all of this kind of active reading stuff, thought carefully about it, and then also potentially watched the video that I had discussing it. And then, but it's okay to also write your reaction before that if you don't want to be, maybe it's even better to do that before you watch the video I have discussing it. That way you'll get a purer kind of response, because I am looking for your response to the piece, not so much just sort of riffing on observations I'm making or anything like that. Obviously, once you have gotten things from my perspective as well, then obviously, that'll hopefully add to what you've already been thinking about the piece, and we can kind of go from there. But anyway, so I think that those are all useful things to do as you're sort of going through and reading. And so this is what we call active reading. It's not just sitting there and reading the words and then closing the book and then putting it on the shelf and not thinking about it again. It's no. Well, we're going to have to be we have to be writing about this. Your summer response writing, for example, is going to ask you to write about one of these pieces. By the way, I just want to say you're expected to read all of the assigned materials, right, for the class. Don't think like, oh, well, I only have to write on one of these, so I have to read one of them. That's not the case. You're expected to read all of them, just so you know, because you're going to have to participate in discussion for all of them. Okay, so just be aware of that. So that's how you can show me that you actually have done the reading, for those pieces in your discussion posts that you're making, because you're gonna have to post about all of the assigned readings. Okay, so just to give an example of this, in Frankenstein, for example, which is a book we are not reading in this class, but which I have assigned in the past. In Frankenstein, there's continually, we see imagery in the book concerning light. Light is a recurrent image in Frankenstein, and we might start to wonder, what does light mean? It specifically, Victor uses it when he has his revelation about how to, generate life from lifelessness, right? When he has that sort of revelation about how to do that, how he can create life. Not resurrect life, but create new life. Apparently, that's what he sort of figures out. And so that's, he talks about it in terms of, a light broke in upon me. Light is often something that in various terms we'll see is utilized as a metaphor for knowledge, right? So that's something I think that is interesting. And so I might, if I was reading Frankenstein and doing active reading, I might note like those areas where that motif comes up, if I wanted to then talk about that later, like if I was going to write about that or wanted to discuss that in class. I might want to note the various areas in the text, and it's a lot easier to just write that in the margin and make notes about that, rather than have to just troll through the book and hope I stumble upon the paragraph where it is. If you're gonna have, obviously with a novel, this kind of thing is even more important. Even though the pieces we're reading in our class are only a few pages long, it's still easier, or to, in a 10-page paper, to mark the paragraph where they talk about some specific thing, and so right where to look for that. It's really useful to sort of have that at hand, rather than have to kind of sit there and dig through the whole piece. So okay, so I think that's everything I wanted to say about active reading. But hopefully this was useful to you, and I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. But okay, so the next video I'm going to do is on descriptive writing. So okay, so I'll see you guys next time. Okay, thanks.